What's going on, Habibis? Siraj Hashmi. It's keeping it halal for Friday, June 12th, in the year of our Lord. In the year of Allah, 2020. Been away for the last couple of weeks, been really busy. Had a ton to do with work and the list. The list has been keeping me busy. Want to start off by talking about CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Now, for those who are not familiar with CHAZ, it is essentially a few hundred protesters gathering and quarantining off like a 6-block area of downtown Seattle known as Capitol Hill. And they basically cordoned off around the East Precinct Police Department of the Seattle Police Department, essentially using it as a demonstration and protest of the police and essentially gathering in the wake of the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Essentially, what has happened is you have an area in which people who are essentially radical leftists, a bunch of hippies, communing, like essentially forming a commune in the middle of Seattle to sort of let their voices be heard. It's been a weird week. It's been a very weird year, but let's get through some of the misinformation surrounding this, because there's some information coming in that sounds like, these are domestic terrorists and, they are essentially Antifa terrorists. I have no idea if they are actually terrorists. I know that a few of them are armed to defend themselves. They're certainly not unarmed, and it's maybe conflating peaceful protesters with, say, something a little bit that's, I wouldn't say violent. They're certainly not violent because it's not destroying everything, but I guess they're just lawless. It's civil disobedience. Probably civil disobedience to the extreme. That's probably the best way of characterizing what CHAZ is. It's civil disobedience to the extreme. The furthest you could possibly go without actually hurting or killing anyone. Because some of the reports coming out is that they're not actually destroying buildings, they're not destroying property. There's still a lot of business owners who are operating in that 6-block radius, and they've at least told reporters that business has been fine. They've actually been getting a lot of walk-ins. But at the same time, you have to look at the actions of the local government. Mayor Jenny Durkin, who has essentially given these protesters a pass. She posted a long thread this week on Thursday, essentially pointing to the fact that she's going to let this protest continue because Orange Man bad, because she hates Trump. Pretty much her entire thread is addressed to Trump, who, by the way, has essentially said that the federal authorities are going to come in and clean the whole thing up. I don't think it's going to end the way that these protesters are going to want. And the reason for that is because they have published a list of demands saying that only when those demands are met, that's when they're going to basically vacate that 6-block area, or CHAZ. I'm just going to read off some of the demands. The first demand is: the Seattle Police Department and attached court system are beyond reform. We do not request reform. We demand abolition. So abolishing the police and all the court systems that exist in Seattle, they want those gone. Number 2, in the transitionary period between now and the dismantlement of the Seattle Police Department, we demand that the use of armed force be banned entirely. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure what that means. I guess they're addressing the police department and disarming them. Number 3, we demand an end to the school-to-prison pipeline and the abolition of youth jails. Get kids out of prison, get cops out of schools. Number 4, we demand that not the city government nor the state government, but the federal government launch a full-scale investigation into past and current cases of police brutality in Seattle and Washington, as well as the reopening of all closed cases reported to the Office of Police Accountability. They also posted 15 other demands about how the loosely organized group would like government to operate in the city moving forward. Interestingly enough, that point on number 4 is that they want the federal government to come in and investigate instances of police brutality. You're never going to get that. Essentially, you're especially not going to get it with President Trump sort of being the executive of the federal government. And it's I don't know what realistic demands they are trying to make here, because none of them are going to be met. But Jenny Durkin, the mayor of Seattle, in one of her tweets, she wrote, "The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ, is not a lawless wasteland of anarchist insurrection. It is a peaceful expression of our community's collective grief and their desire to build a better world. Given his track record, it's not hard to believe that Trump is wrong yet again." Okay, after reading that, there is at least some truth to Mayor Durkin's tweet. It is not a wasteland, but it is certainly civil disobedience. It is a lawless area, and there have been reported crimes happening, robberies, rapes, theft, and the police are not allowed to go in. And Mayor Durkin has essentially given a stand-down order to Seattle police to vacate that East Precinct. Now, I don't understand how feckless a leader you have to be to essentially not enforce the rule of law, because she outlawed the use of CS gas, otherwise known as tear gas, and the Seattle police chief used it in that particular area after the ban. It was a ban for 30 days, and the Seattle police chief used tear gas in that particular precinct where CHAZ is established, because the police chief thought there was going to be violence in that particular area. Now the police precinct in CHAZ has been boarded up, and I've only seen video of like 2 cops going into that precinct, I guess to check on it. I don't know exactly what else they've been doing. But the protesters in CHAZ want to essentially turn that police precinct into like a community center. And when you think about it, yes, this isn't as bad as, say, terrorists actually taking over, a city and threatening demands and, taking hostages. This is several grades below that, not nearly as extreme. But at the same time, it invites other groups, or probably inspires other groups to engage in the same form of civil disobedience and lawlessness, and you could see it happen or spread to other cities. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I have no idea, because we don't know where this will end. So far, not many people have been hurt. I'm sure there have been some people injured. There have been people reportedly raped in this case and have had their things stolen from them. Obviously, those aren't good by any stretch of the means. And I think it's the most striking aspect of it is, where's the level of coverage for a group that takes over 6-block radius of a city? Say if it were a right-wing group taking over, say, downtown Austin, Texas, which is a huge liberal hub in a very red state, which, by the way, is probably shifting demographics. The media would probably go batshit. They would cover this end to end, 24/7, because if they had guns, for a fact that it probably would catch a lot of heat. That being said, we do recall in 2016, you had the Bundy family taking over a federal outpost in Oregon. And at the time, I don't think it actually got a whole lot of coverage, but it certainly got more coverage than, say, maybe CHAZ. Kind of hard to compare the two because the federal outpost that the Bundy family basically took over was abandoned or largely abandoned. It was in the middle of nowhere. And I think a lot of people looked at it and said, oh, they're having this dispute with the Bureau of Land Management. We'll just see how it goes. Ended up with actually one of the members of the Bundy family dying in an FBI shootout. And the members who were involved in the takeover essentially had their case dropped by the DOJ. So I guess it is comparing a bit of apples to oranges right there, and maybe not the best comparison because the two cases are just so different. Other than that, when we look at CHAZ, I mean, in many ways you have to laugh. However, there are many groups that would probably chomp at the bit to take over a police precinct or a 6-block radius of a city or even more, or have a full-on takeover to essentially impose whatever demands they want. And to see the type of leadership from Mayor Jenny Durkin is honestly, it's I wouldn't say it's disappointing. It's not certainly not surprising, but it is in many ways sort of the direction that radical leftists would like to head in. And that is one that lawlessness is more or less a virtue to be achieved and not essentially something that people should discourage. Look, at the end of the day, when we look at this particular CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, civil disobedience is certainly something that, Americans do all the time. Protesting is a constitutional right, the right to assemble. But when you are certainly taking and commandeering your own territory and claiming it as your own, say from the local government, you are inviting other groups to say, maybe the ones that are more nefarious, to say take their own action and possibly get more violent. I'm not saying that the Seattle CHAZ is the worst thing I've ever seen, but it could be a snowball effect where you see more of this happening and people's lives could be in danger. Next up, Sean Hannity decided he wanted to put his foot in his mouth.
He exposed how corrupt, high-ranking law enforcement officials tried to rig an election and destroy Donald Trump at all costs, to overturn an election. Even the president himself, it's not the same thing as what happened to George Floyd, but it's horrific. He was a victim of crooked cops. Now, again, not the same circumstances. I'm not making any comparison. A bad cop is a bad cop. And by all means, by the way, the damage was real to the country. The damage in Minneapolis is real to the country. And that the case, what was done in George Floyd case, should never happen.
Come on, man. Why are you comparing the case of George Floyd, his death on video, one of the most brutal things I've seen with respect to police brutality in recent memory, to Operation Crossfire Hurricane, this operation by the FBI to essentially, investigate Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign and use it to spy on his campaign. It's obviously not the same. And you could tell in that clip that Hannity realized he messed up as he was saying it and tried to basically, pick up his fumble. But man, that is a bad comparison. Qualify the comparison that you're not going to be making a comparison and then continue making the comparison. It's pretty bad. You can look at obviously our criminal justice system has tons of corruption. There's no mistake. We're talking about the loss of a human's life. Someone who was in police custody, there was no justification for his death, versus the politicization of a federal law enforcement agency against a political candidate because they didn't like that particular candidate in Donald Trump and they didn't like their policies or their politics. It's just major oof. That is as glaring as anything I've seen this week. And that someone was going to make that comparison. And there was. Sean Hannity was there to make it. So finally, protests. You had tens of thousands of people, possibly a few million people, hundreds of thousands. I don't know how many. There are a lot of people gathering in the streets to protest against police brutality, to protest systemic racism in law enforcement, to protest, or certainly there to mourn the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And you can even throw in Ahmaud Arbery in that as well. And just the number of black people who have died at the hands of police officers or white police officers. And the most interesting aspect of all of this is the glaring hypocrisy that we've seen in how this has been covered by the media. Of course, it's a very noble, virtuous thing to assemble, to practice your First Amendment rights, to have the freedom of speech, to say what you want without the fear of repercussion from government authorities. The problem is we still have the coronavirus pandemic going on. It's not like that has completely gone away. And we're starting to see a lot of these protesters gather together. And look, you have people wearing masks, and that's a good thing. That does help stop the spread of coronavirus. But you also have to be social distancing. And not everyone has been practicing social distancing. And what we learned from the World Health Organization just in the last week, initially they said if you're an asymptomatic carrier, you can't transmit the coronavirus to another human being. They used the words very rare. And then like a day later, they had to correct that and say, actually, yeah, you can still transmit it. And using very rare was sort of a confusing word to use. A confusing phrase, I should say. It's also not like every protester has been peaceful. There's certainly been hijackings of these peaceful protests by bad faith actors, whether they're part of Antifa, whether they're more radical leftists that don't ascribe to any particular ideology, whether they're just trying to loot businesses, harm business owners, or even kill them, which has happened to a number of people. David Dorn is one of them. He was actually not even a business owner. He was a 77-year-old retired police captain in St. Louis who was trying to protect his friend's pawn shop. And he was shot and killed. Terrible story. And there have been other instances of people being killed during these riots. Of course, these protests have gotten more peaceful since the immediate outbreak of violence in that first weekend since George Floyd died. But at the same time, the way the media is looking at this, they are setting a new standard. Only about a month ago, you had protesters gathering at state capitals, essentially protesting their government's lockdown orders. And they weren't wearing masks. They weren't practicing social distancing. And ultimately, they were being pretty reckless. I don't think it was a very smart idea to protest them. But the media was pretty sure to condemn them because they were protesting Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, and they were gathering at state capitals around the country. The problem is public health experts and officials have since come out in support of these protests against police brutality, essentially saying that it is more pressing and more urgent to protest, systemic racist policies in our law enforcement and criminal justice systems than the coronavirus. And they really boxed themselves into a corner, because as soon as they said that, President Trump was like, all right, I'm basically going to open up and start holding rallies again. And now you got, people, public health experts, and you got Democrats basically being like, what is he doing? He's going to put more and more people at risk of coronavirus. Like, dude, you can't have it both ways. You really can't. As soon as you basically made that position that, these protests are fine to combat racism and police brutality, Republicans are going to take that and run. Now you're boxed into a corner. You've ruined your credibility, for one. And I'm talking about public health experts, the ones who supposedly have been calling the shots over the last few months about coronavirus and saying that it's not good to go out and you should stay home and protect your grandparents, make sure that they don't get coronavirus. Yet they've basically come out and politicized their whole position, their whole industry, and now no one's going to believe them going down the line. They've turned into the World Health Organization, in a sense, because the World Health Organization, for those who aren't aware, obviously a very political organization. Their director general, Dr. Tedros, he appointed Robert Mugabe, the Zimbabwean dictator. He was already dead, by the way, but he appointed him as essentially a goodwill ambassador, knowing full well that Zimbabwe's public health had crumbled and disease was spreading and they weren't doing anything to really address it. Coronavirus here, in this case, World Health Organization, essentially was working with the Chinese government, and either the Chinese government lied to them or they were a willing participant in basically spreading the lie to the rest of the world that the coronavirus cannot be transmitted from human to human. And that is a real tweet that was up in January of 2020. And essentially caught everyone flat-footed to handle and combat the coronavirus. So when you look at it, these protests happening right now, you're going to see a second spike of coronavirus cases. You're already seeing it. You're seeing it in Florida. You're seeing it around the country. You're seeing it initially, it was earlier this week, it was in 9 states. Now that's growing. That's expanded to Florida, unfortunately, because they originally had eased restrictions on essentially they're allowing people to go out and reopening their economy. Despite the fact that 9 states had reopened, or despite the fact that 9 states had a rise in cases, despite the varying instances of them reopening their economies, Florida's going to catch the most heat for it. You just know it's going to happen. So, look, the main figure to look at is hospitalizations. If hospitalizations go up, the number of people who have coronavirus and hospitalizations go up, that might be a little bit more concerning. But I will say this, because I've had friends who've had surgery and they test everyone for coronavirus. So if that person happens to be tested positive while they're going in for, say, an elective surgery or an emergency surgery, they may count that as a hospitalization of coronavirus. So just to read in between the lines right there, because there is going to be a spike in some way, shape, or form. And while President Trump has pledged to not shut down the economy a second time around if there's a spike in coronavirus, we do work in a federalist system. There is a chance that many other states will just shut things down again. And you might have local governments do that as well. I mean, look at the city of Los Angeles. They planned on having their shutdown for at least 3 months, or at least they announced that a month ago. So that's 2 more months. We'll see what happens. And it's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. And if you even look at CHAZ, the Seattle Autonomous Zone, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, it's not like they're practicing social distancing. they're certainly not practicing, all of them wearing masks. I mean, they're all like basically gathering together in a co-op to have free food. I mean, if one person has coronavirus there, they could all get it. And that extends to people who are reporting on it. People who say, like my friend Julio Rosas from townhall.com, can certainly bring it back with him to either his family or his friends, or to his place of employment. I mean, it's really unfortunate that these protests have been marred by coronavirus. We shouldn't have to worry about it. The only thing that they should have to be worried about is ensuring that they're safe and they can vocally or express themselves in a peaceful civic way. But we don't operate in a vacuum. And you can't look at these protests in the same way. And you know that by participating in these protests, you're almost certainly exposing yourself to a deadly virus, in which you may not necessarily be hurt by it, but you could transmit that to other people that you love. And because of the wildly unexpected nature that is this virus, we don't know who it's going to harm. Habibis, that's been Keeping It Halal. If you like what you watch or listen to, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we'll see you next time.